You're either gonna love or hate these 4 sci-fi books, or at least that's the reputation they have. I'm gonna go through each of them and share my thoughts, as well as what kind of readers may or may not enjoy them. So let's get started with To Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. This is the first book in the Terra Ignota series, and was kindly sent to me by a subscriber, Lucas, so thank you, Lucas. And this book follows a story told by a convict, Mycroft Kenner, and is set in the 25th century. A reason to like this book is the depth of world building. Palmer said that she spent at least 5 years developing the world before she even started writing the story, and that comes through in the reading experience. When it comes to technology, culture, social dynamics, religion, and philosophy, this 25th century world feels very different from our 21st century society, but it also feels very real and alive. If you're someone that enjoys power struggles and political scheming in your books, then there's a lot to dive into here. Palmer does a good job of establishing a system and a hierarchy, and then testing how it can be destabilized. Something that I think will work better for some readers than others is the writing style. The book uses language that is inspired by the 18th century for reasons that Mycroft somewhat explains. Palmer also uses a lot of different formatting techniques to represent different forms of communication, as well as things like numeric tables and even interludes from other characters' perspectives that are different from Mycroft. So I think some readers might enjoy this variety, whereas others may find it to be a little bit disjointed. A potential hurdle for some people may be the unlikable characters. Of course, this is subjective, and different readers will form different opinions on each of these characters, but you probably won't find me sharing a beer with many of these guys. I found it pretty hard to connect to most of the characters, and when reading a book, if I'm not finding myself rooting for any of the characters, that's okay as long as I find them interesting. And for me, this was a little bit of a mixed bag. There were a couple of characters that I found to be intriguing, others not so much. I think something that might not work for more plot-focused readers was the pacing and plot progression. For me, there were 2 storylines that I was quite intrigued by, but the book didn't really focus on either of those as much as I wanted it to. One of the main storylines the book follows revolves around what felt like a futuristic BuzzFeed list, and 400 years from now, are we still going to be debating things like top 10 Christopher Nolan movies? Well, yes, probably, but that isn't necessarily what I'm excited to read about in a sci-fi book. And I'm being a little bit silly here. The list in question does have in-world significance, more so than something like Oppenheimer v. Interstellar, but for a book with such a rich world, I never found myself as equally engrossed with the story. Ultimately, I think this is an ambitious and impressive book, but one that I never fully connected with. It intrigued me just enough to have me tempted to read book 2, but for now, it's not a priority. I gave To Like the Lightning a 7 out of 10. Up next we have Tau Zero by Paul Anderson. This story follows a space mission to a star, but when the ship's deceleration system is damaged, it continues to gain velocity. The closer it gets to light speed, the greater the disparity between ship time and external time. I think there's 2 main reasons why Tau Zero might not work for someone. The first is that the character relationships can feel a little bit dated, and the second is that this leans towards the harder end of the sci-fi spectrum. Regarding the relationships, I did find it believable that romances would form on this long mission, and given that it's a relatively small ship, that this would lead to jealousy and tension and drama. However, that isn't necessarily something I'm typically drawn to when reading science fiction. I did also find a number of the characters quite unlikable. Some of the male characters weren't particularly respectful to the female characters on the ship, and while I did like that one of the female characters called them out on their behavior, many of the other female characters didn't add a lot to the story outside of being romantic interests. I think some more balanced characters could have contributed to the story in more interesting ways. When it came to the science, I actually really enjoyed it. I thought Anderson did a great job of explaining some of the concepts like tau or inverse tau in ways that were not only digestible, but added to the story. It's a type of book that makes me feel smart. Just don't ask me to do any of the calculations. For me, this was a book with clear shortcomings, but if you're looking for classic hard sci-fi, I think parts of this book are going to scratch that itch. For me, it was an 8 out of 10. Alright, for our third book we have Absolution Gap by Alistair Reynolds. This is the third book in the original Inhibitor trilogy, although Reynolds did write a fourth book 18 years later, as well as several other books within the Revelation Space universe. I made a video dedicated to Revelation Space, but in case you haven't seen it, I just wanted to quickly mention this one as I think it's the most polarizing book in the series. Different readers in my Discord server mentioned that it was both their favorite and their least favorite book in the sequence. For context, I liked Revelation Space and I loved Redemption Arc. Book 2 is one of my all-time favorite space operas. So something about Absolution Gap that I think some readers will enjoy is the gothic feel. Reynolds combines technology and culture and religion in a way that evokes an eerie sense of uneasiness. And if you're someone that enjoys Reynolds for the scope of his ideas, there's going to be a lot for you to enjoy in Absolution Gap. I don't think he packs in quite as many concepts as he did with Redemption Arc, but I think this is still a very creative and ambitious space opera book. In terms of the characters, I think there were a handful of great moments for existing characters in the series. When it came to the newer characters, I'm not quite sure the time that Reynolds spends developing those characters quite paid off. I felt rather mixed on the ending because it included some intriguing ideas, but narratively, the way that we got to those big ideas wasn't necessarily the most rewarding. For me, this was a little bit of an up and down reading experience. I gave it a 7.5 out of 10. And just quickly before we get to the last book, if you're enjoying the channel and you'd be interested in voting on a book I read each month or joining video hangouts, then check out the link in the description to my Patreon memberships, where you can become a robot, android, or cyborg like Nima and the New Eden. And finally, we have Altered Carbon by Richard K. Morgan. In Altered Carbon, we follow convict Takeshi Kovacs as his consciousness is downloaded into another body, and he is contracted by a billionaire in order to solve the murder of this billionaire's previous body. Now, the polarizing nature of Altered Carbon is in its graphic content. The sex and violence in this book is depicted in a vivid and visceral way, and that's just not something that every reader is going to want to read. I read an interview with Richard K. Morgan where he stated that this was an intentional choice, that the damage that certain weapons do isn't as clean as it's often depicted, and he really wanted you to have to see and feel the consequences of characters that choose to use violence. And for me, that came through in the story. There were several scenes that were quite tough to read, but none of them felt like they were over the top just for the sake of shock value. Each of those scenes revealed something about the world or about a character. And beyond that, Altered Carbon has a really interesting story to tell. In a world where human consciousness can be stored in a stack and then re-sleeved into a different human body, poses a lot of interesting questions. And when you combine that cyberpunk setting with an intriguing murder mystery, I'm totally on board. The setting is well fleshed out, the characters are full of personality, and Morgan also weaves a lot of philosophy into the narrative as well. All of the various conspiracies will keep you on your toes, and the story moves from clues to dead ends to reveals in clever and intriguing ways. This book left me with some powerful quotes that I will remember for a long time, and some haunting images that hopefully I don't remember for quite as long. For me, this book was consistently good and at times great. I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. So those are 4 sci-fi books that I think will appeal to some readers more than others. Personally, I was mixed to positive on all of them, and pretty high on Altered Carbon, which was my favorite. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books in the comments and whether you're interested in picking any of them up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, subscribe. It's free, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.